Welcome to Hill Center. How many of you have never joined us before? Anyone? Wow, yay, new people. Well, welcome. So welcome to, I'd like to welcome back Bill Press from our Talk of the Hill series as he speaks with Joan Quigley tonight about her new book, Just Another Southern Town, about desegregation in DC. And also, we wanted to draw your attention to the Emancipation Day celebration from April 15th to 16th to 17th. They're free programs, so if you check your booklet at page 36, we'd love to have you. So if you'd give a big welcome to Bill Press and Joan Quigley.
Thank you, Heather, and good evening, everybody. Nice to see you, and thanks for coming out on a rainy evening for, I'm sure, a very fascinating discussion about our town and learning more about it. I certainly did reading this book, and Joan, welcome. It's nice to see you. Thank you. You know, we sort of live on that borderline, and where parts of the country are known for different qualities, and the North was always known for its efficiency, and the South for its charm. John F. Kennedy famously said that Washington is a town of northern charm and southern efficiency. When you think about it, it sort of fits, doesn't it? And what I find so fascinating about this book, it's really two stories, and Joan's work, it's really two stories in one. First, a story about a remarkable individual, unsung hero of the civil rights movement in this country, and she is like our sister and daughter here in Washington. And then the story of this town that we live in. And what I found to be pretty shocking instances of where the cradle of democracy was really the center of segregation for years and years here in Washington. And Joan puts it all together and weaves it all together in this book, Just Another Southern Town. So I'd like to talk to you about both Washington and then Mary Church Terrell. Let's start with Washington. Who came up with this phrase, just another Southern town?
Well,
or is it yours?
No, I wish I could claim credit. If you check the beginning of the book in the epigram, it's from Invisible Man.
From?
Invisible Man. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to read fiction from the time period that I was writing about.
Yeah, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison, yeah.
So in the course of also doing the nonfiction research that I did, I read fiction from the time period. In the early 1950s, one of the books I read was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and just reading the book, this line leapt out at me, and that's how it became the title. There were two characters speaking to each other, I believe, on a bus north, and one of them said, again, this is remembered, but one of them said he was going to Washington, and the response was, you know, you're not going north, you're going to Washington, and that's just another southern town.
Yeah. Exact quote. Besides, you ain't going north, not the real north, you going to Washington. It's just another southern town. Yeah. And tell us about that. Describe a little bit, as you do so vividly in the book, what it was like for African Americans living in Washington. We're talking back in the 1910, 1950s and beyond. But.
Well, one, as you said, Washington, we are just below the Mason-Dixon line. And one pivotal element leading up to 1950, which is really the beginning of the story, was the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And I didn't recognize or fully appreciate this, even as an adult, until I started working on the book. But his administration, very early on in his first term, segregated federal employees. That was 1913. Mary Church Terrell moved to Washington after a few years after she graduated from Oberlin College, and that was 1884. She came to Washington with her college degree as a teacher because there were opportunities here for her to teach in Washington's segregated, but very, at the time, she taught at the preparatory high school, which subsequently became Yem Street High School and then Dunbar. And they were hiring college-educated teachers, including herself, and she had 2 African-American female classmates at Oberlin the year she graduated, and I believe one of them was also a colleague teaching here, and it's also where she met her husband, Robert Terrell, who graduated from Harvard, same year she graduated from Oberlin in 1884. So they came to Washington for this.
Just don't want you to tie up. Yeah, right.
They came to Washington for the opportunity to teach, and she came out of Oberlin, which was, maybe some of you here know, a very progressive school and a very progressive town. It had been a site of abolitionists, the Underground Railroad. John Brown's, some of his raiders were from Oberlin. His father was an Oberlin College trustee. So she came very much out of this progressive 19th century tradition to Washington, which was Southern, and she married, and her husband was appointed to a municipal judgeship by Theodore Roosevelt. So they were here for the opportunities they had as college educated, and he had a law degree from Howard, really as the elite for the time period. But by living here, she was exposed to the Southern style, racism, and discrimination, and she wrote about it at the turn of the century, but it just kept getting worse, including the Wilson administration. So to answer your question, by 1950, for several decades, Washington had been rigidly segregated. Schools, of course, have been segregated, but businesses, restaurants, hotels, there was a rigidly enforced color line throughout the downtown area. There were a few exceptions. Union Station would serve black and white customers together. Federal government cafeterias integrated during Franklin Roosevelt's administration. And streetcars by law were integrated. But for the most part, out in Washington, in the business district, people, in some cases there were Jim Crow counters, but in many, many cases, African American patrons were excluded altogether. And this was the system that she had lived with for decades by the time she got interested in started a civil rights challenge.
If I could just read something that she wrote in 1907, quote, this is Mary Church Terrell, and surely nowhere in the world do oppression and persecution based solely on the color of the skin appear more hateful and hideous than in the capital of the United States, because the chasm between the principles upon which this government was founded, in which it still professes to believe, and those which are daily practiced under the protection of the flag, yawns so wide and deep. Writing about Washington, D.C., right?
Right.
You mentioned the streetcars. There were several attempts to segregate on the streetcars. It seemed to be kind of a passion of the Southern legislators at the time.
Absolutely. Often came about as part of a reaction. There's one incident I write about in the book when a Southern, an Alabama senator from the Heflin family, probably the original Heflin, his nickname was Cotton Tom, and he introduced legislation to segregate the streetcars, I believe in 1909. He said that segregation had in essence cured the racial situation in the South, and so as a Southerner, he made a point of trying to segregate Washington's streetcars.
And you mentioned the Jim Crow tables at some restaurants, and there were Jim Crow cars, I didn't realize that, on trains at the time. That she...
interstate trains.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Right, I'm not talking about the streetcars
Right.
here.
And the Supreme
That she
Court
had
dealt
to deal
that.
with.
Right. Yes. She traveled a lot in the South. She was a lecturer and a writer at the early part of the 20th century. And so as Reconstruction ended and the South started imposing Jim Crow laws, including after the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, she wrote in her diary about traveling in the South and beginning to experience pushback, we would call it today, from train conductors. On occasion, she would be told that, if the train crossed into Virginia from another state, she's coming back to Washington, she'd be told she had to leave to go to the Jim Crow car. Didn't always happen to her, but sometimes it did. And it created dilemmas for her as to how to handle it.
You mentioned Woodrow Wilson. I had no idea before reading your book that Woodrow Wilson was such a racist. I mean, we celebrate him, right? League of Nations and World War I and all of that, and as a great progressive Democratic president. But what was his story at Princeton before he became president? And there's news on that today.
There is news on that today, and I should also disclose I am an alum. And and I didn't know, again, until I started working on this book, that A, he had segregated the federal workforce, and B, he had, as the Princeton University president, he had inherited and kept intact a policy of excluding African American students from attending the university. And the news today is that Princeton has, after several months of study, made several changes in terms it's going to initiate diversity pushes in hiring. Students had asked them to change the name of the Wilson School and Wilson College. That is apparently not going to happen. But they are implementing other changes on campus, including trying to increase the dialogue about this very aspect of his legacy, because it has been absent from the narrative.
May I suggest that might be another book you mentioned?
There are some great biographies of Wilson.
I'm not sure the biographies that reveal all of this. At least I haven't seen one of them. But and what about the Wilson? Is there any talk about the Wilson Institute in Washington while we're sort of erasing parts of his history? And
I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Just another touch on Washington before we get to back to Mary Church Terrell. But it was so bad, as you point out, that African American troops who served in World War I from Washington and came back to Washington couldn't eat in the restaurants, couldn't work in the federal government.
Right.
It's stunning when you think about it.
After fighting in segregated units, the war that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. It's a very important point because World War I and World War II brought protests to Washington. After World War I, there was a race riot in 1919. And I think this is relevant to her story as well, and you touched on it with the quote from her, is that central tension in having a capital city, Washington, D.C., that is the headquarters of our democracy, and also the symbol, just the most powerful global symbol from the buildings, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the White House, just this iconography of democracy. And yet, also coexisting with segregation. And that tension became apparent, especially during and after the World Wars, and then leading up to the Korean War in her case. Right. This idea that African Americans are sacrificing their lives in the military, but being required to serve either in a segregated military or when they return from service, being told they can't sit here or there or
in fact, the cover photo on the book shows some protesters, one of whom is this African-American gentleman with a sign saying, "I fought in Korea, but I can't eat here." But this race riot you mentioned on the mall was actually begun by and led by white troops.
Right.
Who were protesting just any effort to integrate Washington, right?
Right. It got started with allegations of racial sexual assaults that had been in both the black and white press, I think irresponsibly, and the NAACP, I believe, had warned the papers of the possibility of a race riot. And it was hot. It was July. This is Washington without air conditioning. It was also during Prohibition. And it was a cicada season. I just saw a photograph of a cicada, the 17-year, right. So it was a cicada year as well. So just imagine July in Washington without air conditioning, and you have this racially charged tension. You have returning troops coming back from the war. The saloons are all dry. It was, and that was a summer, some of you probably already know, the summer of 1919, there were racial riots across the country, but the one that happened here went on for days, and they had to call, eventually, federal troops.
Now, Mary Church Terrell, that's in front of a bust of Frederick Douglass, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Incredible woman, born in 1863, the year of the Emancipation Proclamation, and died in 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education. So she really kind of encompasses the whole movement, really. Right. And as you point out, I mean, she was from a fairly wealthy family, went to Oberlin, married well. She was on the lecture circuit, traveling around. So we're getting to Thompson's cafeteria, but she was very well known.
Yes.
When she walked into Thompson's cafeteria in 1950, right? 6 years before Rosa Parks, she decided to take things into her, to take the step here in Washington to protest this segregation in the restaurants, starting at Thompson's cafeteria, which was where?
725 14th Street, near what was Garfinkel's, a few blocks from the Willard Hotel. We do have a photograph of the exterior, if Heather wouldn't mind.
There it is.
There it is. I wish it were larger, but it's from a newspaper photo.
So tell us about that day. She walked in with some friends.
Right.
How old was she?
86.
Imagine that. Yeah. 86, right. She'd been her whole life as she was preparing for this, right?
Right, absolutely. What got her to that point? That was the question that drove me while I was writing the book. Why not just enjoy a retirement at age 86? But she did walk in with, it was January 27th, 1950. She had 3 other people with her, 2 African-American local activists. One was a minister, one was active in the labor union, and a white gentleman from an interfaith community. I believe he was a Quaker. And they walked in to this cafeteria, the kind of place where you take a tray and you put the tray on the rail and you walk through the line, and then there was a separate dining area where people would sit at tables. And they took their trays and started to go through the line and didn't even get to the cashier stand before the manager came in and stopped them and said they couldn't be served because they were African American.
And they left?
They left eventually. That she and one of her colleagues challenged him a little bit. You know, I think she said, "Do you mean you?" And I'm paraphrasing. "You can't serve me in the capital of the United States." And yes, that was the answer.
But it didn't stop there, right? Because she did file a lawsuit, or people did for her, and with this strange situation at the time, that actually, you can tell us, but as I understand, because of post-Reconstruction, there were laws in place in the district that prohibited discrimination.
Exactly.
Yeah. So on the books, but not in practice.
Right. Anti-discrimination ordinances. Restaurants can't discriminate on the basis of race. That had been on the books since the early 1870s and just languished. They hadn't been enforced.
So technically, what the restaurant was doing was against the law.
Yes, it was a misdemeanor.
But in practice, right?
Right. The laws were on, I mean, that did become an issue in the litigation. Had the laws been repealed, were they still valid? But what the restaurant was doing, and that was the whole reason she went into the restaurant that day, was to set up this challenge, to bring a test case in court that was seeking to revive these old laws that she and other, well, I almost just called her a lawyer, that she and lawyers knew had been on the books. And the idea was to press the issue.
All right, so she files this and she goes to district court. Yeah. And the outcome?
The outcome, well, 3.5 years later.
Not the eventual outcome. I'm going to build up to the Supreme Court. But at the district court.
At the district court level, oh man.
She is turned down. She's turned down.
And then an appeal as well.
Right.
Still in the DC local court system.
Right.
They side with the restaurant.
which is when they go to the Supreme Court. And I was struck by the fact that it was the Eisenhower administration that decided that this was not right, and they asked the Supreme Court to take this appeal, not only that, but to take it on an expedited fashion.
Right.
Because this was of national significance that this situation be allowed to exist here in Washington, D.C. So you get to the Supreme Court. And another hero of the book, who wrote the
Justice William O. Douglas wrote a majority unanimous opinion for the court in the case. Now,
8-0.
8-0.
William O. Douglas, another great progressive, so it's nice to see that they come together here.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Imagine getting an 8-0 ruling today.
Right. And it was a year before Brown. I mean, Brown was a unanimous decision, but that was a year later.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what was the impact of that decision? I mean, and that sort of sets up her place in history.
The impact was immediate. Restaurants started serving right away. They had fought hard for 3.5 years, the Restaurant Association and their lawyers. And when it got to the Supreme Court and they lost unanimously, the Restaurant Association sent out word to its members that the Supreme Court had decided that segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C. were illegal. They basically upheld these old Reconstruction-era laws. And within days, the restaurant started serving everyone. And she went back to Thompson's restaurant. And with, pardon me? Yes.
Yeah.
She went back and brought some of her colleagues with her, and there were photographers and people from the media there. And the manager carried her tray to her table. And she sat down and ate, and the photographer took her photograph. And there was a minister who was there who got there early so that he could watch her walk through the line. And he said, it's like another emancipation.
This is 1953.
Right, June of 1953.
So why is she such an unsung hero? Has anybody written about her before you?
Yes, there have been historic articles, sort of journal articles about her. I think there are a few children's books.
Yeah. I'm curious. Raise your hand. Have anybody heard of Mary Church Terrell before tonight? Really? Okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, great. I must admit.
Terrell.
Mary Church Terrell. Oh, Terrell, not Terrell. Terrell. Thank you. Oh, there is. Which is where? Terrell High School here in
Junior.
Terrell Junior High here in
Yes.
here in the district. Yeah. Well, what I was wondering also is, we are a city with a lot of wonderful outdoor sculpture, and I know Lincoln Park, Mary McLeod Bethune. Is there a statue to Mary Church Terrell anywhere in the district? Anybody know? Should be. Yeah, that's your next project. Another project of yours.
The original. I'll answer your question to the best of my ability if you want, but I'll do them in reverse order. The original Hex department store building across the street from the Verizon Center is now called Terrell Place because she led a boycott of and picket lines at Hex because their basement lunch counter segregated. So while she was bringing her case all the way up to the Supreme Court, they were also, she and her colleagues were picketing outside dime stores, and Hex was part of that. As to why she isn't better known, it's complicated. I think the simplest answer is that though her case was a pivotal part of the court's build-up to Brown, I think they took it on an expedited basis on purpose because it just applied in Washington, and unlike Brown and the school cases, which were very complicated and dealt with the 14th Amendment and had already an equal protection clause, the court had already heard oral argument in Brown and all the cases and just couldn't coalesce about how to decide them. Her case was so focused and didn't actually raise a constitutional challenge that it made it easy to push it out. And it had great symbolic importance. It was the capital. Everyone who brought the case knew that. Activists going back to A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin after World War II knew how important it was to attack the symbolism, the hypocrisy of segregation in Washington. I think the court knew that too. And the same day the court decided her case, it scheduled Brown for a second round of oral argument. So it's a part of this buildup to the court getting to that place. Her case? Actually, it was District of Columbia versus John R. Thompson Company, Inc. And because they were misdemeanor laws, the district had to bring the case. She couldn't actually technically bring it on her own. She had to convince the local prosecutors to bring the case on her behalf. But because her case came out before Brown, and Brown was such a huge decision a year later, the focus after Brown shifted to the South. I think part of the answer is just that it was a precursor that got lost in the big and very important decision of Brown versus Board of Education. I also think, and this is based on going through NAACP records and my own inferences, that because she was a woman and she was taking on a role, even though she was a charter member of the NAACP in 1909, on this case she worked outside of the NAACP, I think for a number of reasons. But she did this with other lawyers who were not NAACP lawyers. They were from the National Lawyers Guild at a time when, in the early 1950s, when people were being investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Yeah. And the National Lawyers Guild was viewed as on the wrong side of that equation. And at a certain juncture, she was too, I think because of her involvement in this case. But I think also because she, even as a charter member of the NAACP, didn't go through their channels, I think that created some dissonance.
Now, your question's next, but I must go here, as uncomfortable as it may be, because reading the book and hearing her story and what she did and what Washington was like at the time led me to the question is, how's Washington today? I mean, okay, we're better in some respects, but we're not pure, right?
No.
What's your take on Washington, the color line today?
There's a lot of work to do in this city and this country. On the one hand, President Obama, in his first inaugural address, I think alluded to, I have no basis for knowing, but he at least alluded to the fact that 60 years earlier his father would not have been served in a Washington restaurant. And that's this history. So yes, there has been progress, but there's this city and this country have a long way to go, and schools are just a starting point.
Terrell and I came here in 1996, and a very, very good friend of ours, African-American woman in the labor movement, came from California 3 years ahead of us. And we'd been here maybe 6 months, and I remember getting together with our friend. So we said, how are you enjoying Washington? And she said, well, it's really strange to live in such a segregated city. And I said, what? Because for us, it seemed like the most diverse city we'd ever lived in, living on Capitol Hill. And she said, oh, well, maybe during the day, it's open. But she said, go downtown at night, and you'll be in a segregated city, which I think is still pretty much true, sadly.
Great.
Not by law. Maybe
not by law, no. Economics and real estate.
And schools.
And schools, which are related to real estate.
Right. Joan Quigley, thanks for writing the book. Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
tonight. Thank you very much. Washingtonians, do you have a microphone? I can say it's the microphone. Yeah. A question or a comment or an observation? All of the above. Welcome. Yeah, let's start over here. Right. Please wait for the mic just so that we can.
She was a public speaker. Who was she speaking to?
She went out on, did everybody hear the question? Who was she speaking to? This was early 20th century. She started in late 19th. She went out on the lecture circuit. Chautauqua's, she had paid speaking engagements where she would speak in front of groups. I remember the American Missionary Association was a group she addressed. Activists. There was organization during the Progressive era, so early 20th century, that promoted purity. So she spoke in front of them. She went in large measure where she was invited, where she could receive a speaking fee. But this was what she had an opportunity to do. It was a source of income. It was also a way for her to get the message out. She was very entrepreneurial. She wrote, she spoke, she was working in multiple platforms.
Yeah, and was known and was popular, and according to, from what I've read. And remember, she didn't go to Thompson's until she was 86, right? So she had a very, very active career beforehand.
She was actually internationally recognized too, I should point out. As early as 1904. Right. She was speaking abroad as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. Connie, make sure that mic is on, please. No. Yes, we need the mic.
Can you hear? Yeah,
yes,
there it is on. Okay. I'm curious about her early life. Was she from Ohio, or how did her family was well-to-do? What's her history?
She was born in Memphis. Her parents were both former slaves, and her father earned a lot of money in real estate speculation. Also, he owned bordellos and a billiard hall. He was a very wealthy man, and she grew up with great wealth and privilege. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother wanted her to get an education in Ohio, so she went at a very young age, I think maybe 6, kindergarten-ish, to start her studies in Ohio. Southern Ohio first, and then up to Oberlin, where she went to the public schools and graduated from opportunities for African Americans that didn't exist in the South, in Memphis. And then Oberlin, as I said, was such a progressive community.
And married Robert Terrell, and then they divorced, and then so she supported herself right through the public lecture circuit.
Well, they stayed married. They were married.
Oh, I thought they did divorce.
Her parents
separated.
did.
But she and Terrell stayed married? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll go back and reread.
She did travel a lot. They had a house in Highland Beach, where she spent the summers, Highland Beach, Maryland, near Annapolis. She was a very independent woman. She grew up really without restrictions because of the money she had, and because of living in Oberlin, where it was probably as close as one could come to being able to live without just an integrated community. And she expected from a young age to do something with her life, to either to write or to contribute to her race. And so I think that was a tension she felt as a married woman. It's clear from reading her journals. And so I think at certain points in her marriage, she just was very frustrated that she didn't have more opportunities. And as soon as her husband died, she started writing her memoirs.
Yes. Question here and there and there. Right.
Your research showed that the situation racially in Philadelphia and New York was far different than Washington in those years before '54.
Very good question.
That is a very good question, and I have to confess, I didn't look into that. I just focused on D.C.
Well, it came up because Ohio seemed to be an integrated society. I
right.
wanted to know where another southern town line ended.
It's a very good question. I wish I could give you an answer.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's fair to draw a distinction between. I grew up in Cleveland, so I think it's fair to you to do.
You know, probably that line. It certainly was above Baltimore somewhere. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What access did you have to her personal writings, and where are they held?
Yes, that is a good question. And her papers and her husband's papers are at the Library of Congress. So the vast, vast majority of what they kept, and they kept a lot. So that was just great, being able to go there. There's some papers also of hers at Howard, and there were some that her relatives had in Highland Beach that they just very generously donated to Oberlin College. And Oberlin had a collection of her papers before that, but they've now increased it pretty sizably. So that's where most everything I know of is.
Which is so important, the access to those papers, right? I mean, that tells the whole story. I guess while we're if you don't mind, while we're on this side of the room, yeah, we'll have a hand too. Yes.
Were there other legal challenges to segregation in D.C. A little bit before, after hers? I mean, I guess hers was the first. Is it understanding, or
that's a very good and insightful and important question, because Brown was actually, the case we think of as Brown v. Board of Education was actually 5 cases. Brown out of Kansas and 4 others. And one of the 4 other jurisdictions was Washington, D.C. So there was a challenge to Washington's segregated schools making its way up in the federal courts at the same time. But because the Supreme Court took all of the school segregation cases and packaged them together, the fate of Washington's segregated schools was marching in lockstep with those 4 other cases, including Brown. And that was the Bowling case, which the Supreme Court decided on the same day, May 17th, 1954, that it decided the Brown decision. It's a separate decision for Washington, D.C., because the 14th Amendment doesn't apply, because D.C. is not a state, it's a Fifth Amendment case. But Bowling decided that Washington's segregated schools were unconstitutional. It's just that it took that extra year for the decision to be made about Washington's segregated schools, because the court had to tackle that case with Brown. And so when Brown got rescheduled for another round of oral argument on June 8th, 1953, the same day as Thompson, so did Washington segregated schools. Does that make sense? Okay.
It is surprising there weren't more challenges along the way, which is what I kind of read in your question. And that it took until 1950 for somebody to really take it on head on.
And I think that's part of why she's so important and why she was so brave. I suspect that part of the reason Washington segregation hadn't been challenged is because the power of the Southerners in Congress, who controlled regulation of Washington, D.C. I suspect that's why the NAACP was not involved in her case, because they were also trying to get litigation and civil rights legislation through Congress. So it was very, very bold and very brave, I think, to start in 1950 the case that she did. As you said, 6 years before Rosa Parks. It was a decade before the lunch counter protests.
Did you have a question? Yes. We can hear you, but for the videotape, we need to ask the microphone.
On what grounds did the D.C. courts throw this out if there was no law to justify segregating public spaces? What could they possibly say?
I know one of the decisions said, well, the laws have been repealed or abandoned by non-enforcement, or right.
Because they'd been ignored, they therefore no longer applied. That was the argument. Yeah. And the Eisenhower administration had to say, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but they had to say, no, they're still on the books, and by right and by law, they should be applied. And so you can't just say they no longer apply because it's been so long since anyone paid attention to them.
Right. Actually, the Supreme Court's decision was just a few months into Eisenhower's term, and right before the Supreme Court agreed to take her case, he gave his first State of the Union address. And in it, he said he would end segregation in Washington. So all of a sudden, the Supreme Court has political cover. It has the brand new Republican president saying segregation in D.C. has to end. And one can only imagine 2 months later when they agreed to take her case.
And didn't Eisenhower kind of take credit for it?
Yes, he did. He made a speech in South Dakota, and standing in front of Mount Rushmore, actually, I believe, to some young Republicans, and it was right after the decision came down from the Supreme Court, and he said, yes, our administration has successfully, I'm paraphrasing, but successfully argued in the bar of the Supreme Court that segregated restaurants in Washington are invalid. And when she went back to Thompson's restaurant, that was the front page story that day. And either that day or before the next edition of the Afro-American, the local black newspaper, came out, she made it clear that she was not happy with his remarks, that he was not responsible for this win in the Supreme Court.
That he basically had nothing to do with it. He just came along at the right time, and,
Right.
And his administration did push it. But Eisenhower made history of himself in terms of inviting a couple of African Americans for the first time since Teddy Roosevelt was the first,
Right.
correct? With Booker T. Washington, I believe,
That's right.
inviting for dinner at the White House, and nobody until Eisenhower invited.
Until after her decision.
Oh, after the decision too,
Right.
yeah.
That July. So like within a month, the first African-American dinner guest at the White House since Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Booker T. Washington was the previous, and that became a huge firestorm in the South and the beginning of backlash. One of the guests, I believe, was the president of Howard, who went in 1953. That was the question. Might have been, yeah.
Fascinating story, and I'd love a chance to look at ourselves and see how we're doing. Yes, ma'am. We'll get the microphone over to you, then we can wrap up.
I'm a native Washingtonian, grew up here all my life. There's another Washington, D.C. segregation story that's not often told about the National Theater, which was segregated, closed down rather than integrate for several years. And had a pretty progressive parent. My mom decided when they finally reopened, she was at the box office the first day the theater reopened and bought tickets, and they gave her box seats.
Wow.
Is that right? All right.
You know, I'm guessing I was about 6 or 7 years old the first time I went to theater. Porgy and Bess.
Oh.
Wow.
Oh. Yeah.
No.
Well, in fact, after I meant to ask you about this. After liberating the restaurants, if you will, right? Mary Church Terrell's next target were movie theaters in Washington.
Right.
Didn't take that long, did it?
No, it only took a few weeks. She'd won in the Supreme Court unanimously. How were they? At this point, she's almost 90 years old, and she announced that on her 90th birthday that she had targeted movie theaters, and literally within weeks they caved. And she said that the restaurant campaign had been the longest and hardest of her career, but the movie one was the shortest and easiest. It's paraphrasing, but.
And what about hotels? Where did they
That's such a good question. Somewhere in there, but not directly, as far as I know, not directly through her initiative. She focused on dime stores, department stores, the lunch counters, and the restaurants. And then, as we just said, the movie theaters. I'm not, for reasons I'm not quite sure about, I don't exactly know. I do know that Josephine Baker came to Washington to draw attention to the Hex controversy in the summer of '52, and she stayed at the Willard. I do remember reading that. So,
And Martin Luther King stayed at the Willard, where he drafted the I Have a Dream speech. Yeah, so
I have read that Thurgood Marshall had
2
trouble.
years later.
Thurgood Marshall had trouble finding hotel rooms up until a certain point when he was in Washington, including, I think, for arguing cases. But whether they did so voluntarily, I'm not sure. But just there are a few more. If we could,
Yeah.
that would be great. Thanks. This was taken 2 months after Plessy v. Ferguson. Mary Church. It was in July of 1896, 2 months after the decision, and a new organization had just formed of African American women. It was called the National Association of Colored Women. They had a convention in Washington, and after the convention, she was elected the first president, and after the convention, they took what they called a pilgrimage to Harper's Ferry. which is interesting because it brings it back to Oberlin and John Brown.
John Brown, right.
And they're posing in front of the federal arsenal where he was caught at when he staged his raid. This is Justice Douglas, who wrote the majority opinion in the Thompson case, and he's actually with Mohammed Mossadegh, who was visiting the court in the fall of 1951. Justice Douglas was sort of a wide-ranging intellect like Teddy Roosevelt and very much imprisoned within the walls of the court. So whenever he could leave and go trotting and traveling around the world or mountain hiking or mountaineering, he was much happier. But he dabbled in foreign affairs. He's on the right. With the chin jutting out and the hands in his pockets. Very brilliant. I guess you don't need to say very, but just a brilliant, eccentric person who, at the time, I'm sure was not writing many majority opinions. He did write Thompson, very liberal and very interested in global affairs, and also writing books, just a nonfiction book a year during this time period he was releasing. Quite an intellect. No big names. A local Washington lawyer who had come out of the Corporation Counsel's office for the restaurants, and then the Corporation Counsel's office. And then, well, I should be fair for the Justice Department, Philip Ellman, who is a very important civil rights lawyer, and in some circles is a big name because he was writing all these very important briefs, including the Brown briefs and briefs in the Thompson case, I believe. He was a former law clerk to Felix Frankfurter, and very instrumental in shaping the government's arguments.
So the government did present this.
The Justice Department did, on behalf, right.
So I wasn't totally wrong.
That's correct. The truth was somewhere in between. I mean, they did come along for her, what seemed like the 11th hour. But yes, having the Justice Department participate in briefing and oral argument is a big deal.
There we are.
This is the Supreme Court in early 1953. The justices who decided her case. Let's see, Eisenhower is in the front row, fourth from the left. There's Justice Douglas on the left with his hands in his pockets again. Felix Frankfurter, front row, far right. Next to him is Hugo Black, so he's second from the right. A lot of the justices at this time you've never heard of, that back row in particular. They were the Truman appointees in large measure.
There are too many, though. There are 10, aren't there?
I think there's some White House staffers. I believe this photograph
right.
was taken at the White House. Mm-hmm. So this was also the Brown court -1. The gentleman in the, third from the left is the then Chief Justice Fred Vinson, and he died and was replaced by Earl Warren. These are either FDR appointees, all in the front row, or Truman appointees in the back. Yeah. And this is a lovely portrait of Mary Church Terrell from the Portrait Gallery. It was painted in 1946, and it's on the second floor. They have a civil rights exhibit there now.
Still at the Portrait Gallery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just took this a week or two ago. Betsy Renaud Graves. Yeah, I'm not familiar with her either, but I think that's the last image. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, there we go. So Joan, thank you so much. And again, it's a part of our history that I knew very, very little about. Just fascinated by it. Love the book, and it weaves together, as Joan has shown us tonight, the story of Washington, the story of Mary Church Terrell, Dwight Eisenhower, William O. Douglas, Woodrow Wilson. They all sort of come together, and it's a fascinating story and a very important story. And we thank you for sharing it with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Down here at the end, there is a table set up. Books are available, and Joan will be glad to autograph them for you on the way out, and highly recommend it. Great to know more about Washington. Thank you.